can make strategic and creative choices for specific effects by varying the type of language we use. We need to be aware that every choice we make has implications, whether conscious or not, because it represents things in a particular way. As an analogy, let's think about the way a child draws things. Their imagination draws on things they have heard in stories and seen in films and TV, doesn't it? Their working out of how the world works is shaped by what they hear and see around them, though crucially, they build it into their own reality in ways unique to them. This is even more pertinent when they take part in imaginary play. We will often hear them use specific words and phrases from their community or from the media, and we'll see them debate and negotiate who should or shouldn't have certain roles, depending on their gender and age, for example. The relationship of our grown-up reality to language and media can be considered in a similar way. Language and media don't just reflect reality in the way a mirror reflects physical objects. Language and media also construct our reality for us, because we work out what to think about people and events from what we see, hear, and read. Whether we accept or challenge the representations, we take them on board and work with them. On a much bigger scale, we can say that language and media also construct the shared reality of groups and societies, as well as reflecting it. If you think about it then, there's a lot riding on the words you choose to represent things with in your professional written communication. There are some things that representations give rise to that are particularly important for this module. A key one is connotations. In advertising speeches and other persuasive genres, we will proactively use words whose connotations fit our purpose. But it's important to remember that connotations have force in more factual genres too. Any one event that is covered in the media can be represented in multiple ways. It's important to consider how the reader or viewer might evaluate the different people and things in the story if they only read or see one version of the event, depending on what connotations that version gives rise to. I'm going to use some examples from coverage of demonstrations against global capitalism and privatisation that took place on May Day 2001. I know many of you were not even born then, but I continue to use this example because the range of representations is so striking. I was at the event myself, and of course we all start from a different stance or point of view in how we read things. So you need to bear in mind that I'm going to read all of this from the point of view of someone who supported the spirit of the demonstrations. There is a lot of retrospective analysis of the events of that day available online, so you could explore it further and evaluate some of the representations for yourself if it sparks your interest. Here are some of the words that were used to represent demonstrators in news coverage of the event. You'll immediately notice how negative the connotations of a lot of the words are. Do you notice also that they fall into categories? The demonstrators have been represented in terms of violent criminal activity, low socioeconomic status, and lack of intelligence. What is also striking is that most of the coverage has clearly focused on demonstrators that involved themselves in altercations. Anthea and her friends wandering along peacefully to demonstrate what they believe in is not news. Altercations between demonstrators and police is news. We'll discuss that second aspect more a little later in the video. For now though, given these patterns, we could say that the demonstrators have been negatively stereotyped by some of the coverage. I'd like you to try now to carry out some similar analysis to what I just did. doing it yourself rather than just listening to and watching me do it will help you to reinforce your understanding of what I've been talking about. Pause the video here if you'd like to try this task. So, how did you get on? Did you notice differences? Perhaps they were differences of level of positivity or negativity, or perhaps they were differences of category of what the word's connotations related to. Remember earlier I highlighted how the altercations on the demonstration were focused on more than the people having a relatively ordinary time on the demonstration were. This relates to questions of what is newsworthy and how newsworthy something is. There are news values that construct the news, although this can be at an ideological rather than a conscious level. So editors and journalists will indeed meet at the beginning of the news day, pitch stories, debate on what should be covered and so on. They won't, however, be saying things like, so which news values shall we apply today, guys? The notion of news values we're discussing here is based on patterns that academic researchers have noticed about stuff that editors and journalists do, rather than on stuff that editors and journalists actually proactively do. News values dictate what stories will be chosen and which aspects of these will be highlighted. The first theorists to introduce the idea of news values were Galtung and Ruge in 1965, and Bell and Branston and Stafford, among others, have developed their ideas. I like Branston and Stafford's list. It contains 11 news values, but I've chosen for you the 6 that I think are the most pertinent for our purposes on this module. And I've provided my own hopefully straightforward definitions of what they are. I'll talk you through them. Threshold is how big something is. A story can be big because it affects a lot of people, like the COVID-19 coverage, for example, or because it will have a big impact, even if it just involves one person or a small number of people. For example, a research finding around vaccines or treatment for COVID. Proximity is how close something is. A story can be geographically or politically or ideologically close. So, COVID became a much bigger news story in the UK and Ireland when people here contracted the disease. If there are developments in research in different parts of the world, but one of those is Northern Ireland, it will be more likely to be covered by our national news providers. Ideologically speaking, it is striking how little general news we get from other European countries, yet we get a lot from the US. That might seem surprising given the European countries are geographically closer. That's where political or ideological proximity comes in. If you follow both BBC and RTE News, for example, you have probably noticed that there is much more coverage of Europe on RTE, coming from an Irish perspective, than there is on the BBC, coming from a UK perspective. And this was already the case long before Brexit. Negativity kind of speaks for itself. It is how bad something is. Bad news makes the headlines much more readily than good news. Though you will notice that broadcast news providers usually aim to include a good news story at the end of a bulletin, and newspapers include a small amount to balance the bad. Predictability is how predictable something is. This is trickier to explain. We could relate it to the point I made about which aspects of the demonstration made the news. Due to the way society thinks about demonstrations, possibly due to how they've been covered in the past, we kind of expect that there will be violence at them, even though this is often not the case. So as soon as there is, that is predictable and will be covered more readily than non-violent aspects. Personalisation is how much a story can be linked to a specific person or people. You have maybe heard this referred to as human interest stories. Perhaps because we make sense of things by relating them to our own experience, some news providers presume that people will want to hear about the experience of a person they can relate to, rather than hear about a story in a general or political sense. An example would be the story of a survivor of COVID being chosen over a broad story about figures and debates, or the story of one refugee or soldier involved in a situation of conflict. You will notice that personalisation happens more often with what are called tabloid providers. So newspapers such as The Sun, The Mirror, and in the Northern Ireland context, The Sunday Life. If you follow broadcast news, you might notice that ITV or UTV are more likely to cover stories in a human interest way than the BBC is, for example. Stories that are personalised are even more likely to make the news if they are about someone elite, so a politician or a celebrity, for example. Narrativization is how much like a good story something is, or has the potential to be. This may seem obvious given we're talking about news stories, as in they are all stories. What it means, though, is the extent to which a story can be given a recognisable narrative shape that we recognise. Are there obvious good guys and bad guys, for example? Is someone overcoming adversity or an obstacle in their life? Is a family reunited? That sort of thing. I'd like you to do another task to reinforce your understanding of news values. Here are the instructions. Pause the video until you've done the task. So, how did you get on? Did you notice anything interesting? These things are more striking with some stories than they are with others, so don't worry if you didn't notice much. Bear news values in mind as you consume the news you usually consume over the next day or two, and you'll maybe notice more. I do hope you've enjoyed exploring representation and news values with me. You'll notice that in this week's folder of content, there's a bonus video. I've made it a bonus video because you don't strictly need to know and understand the content that's in it. But if you're finding that you've really got quite into analysing some more of the intricacies of how language is used in news, you might want to check it out. It goes into a bit more detail about how sentence structure can affect representation. It's completely up to you whether you explore this or not. As long as you've got your head round word choice and news values, you're good to go. See you soon.